Our story begins with a wounded young man running for his life at full speed. Without understanding how he ended up in such a dangerous situation, he was dashing through the snow, the biting cold tearing at him, unable to grasp the reason behind his ordeal, or why someone was chasing him at all. While burdened with countless unanswered questions, he was suddenly struck from behind by a hidden weapon, this time hitting his legs, sending him crashing to the ground, unable to bear the pain. Despite the injury, his only thought was to rise and keep running. But at that moment, a man holding a sword appeared behind him. The man, who turned out to be a hired assassin, told him that if he truly believed he could escape, he'd have to try much harder. He added that dying willingly would make things easier for everyone. The assassin was not alone. Behind him stood a group of other killers, all addressing the wounded young man by the name Mr. Yu Bake. Yu Bake didn't respond to their words. Instead, he began to wonder if this fate would have been inevitable had he never accepted the bet in the first place, noting that had he not entered that adventure, he wouldn't have become a character inside a game. He remembered being just an ordinary guy in the real world, sitting in front of his computer screen, playing a game when a message suddenly popped up from someone asking if he was ready to accept a bet. That person told him that if he agreed, they'd grant him one wish. The young man asked if that wish could make him rich. It was the first time he had seen anyone talk about bets in the chat room meant for veteran players. He was still able to finish the game using the character Yu Bake, though he didn't know where the other players had gone or why they'd left the game altogether. It turned out to be a game featuring portals to another world, from which various monsters would emerge. The events took place in a modern setting, where players controlled hunters tasked with facing those creatures. From the first day of its release, the game gained massive popularity due to its vast and complex world. It started with 5 characters, each with hidden elements and unique powers, and although it was a single-player game, its following was huge. However, that success didn't last long. Within a year, no player had managed to complete it because the 5 characters died too easily. When one of them died, the player had to start over from the beginning. As a result, the game became known among its users for its hellish difficulty, with only about 1 in every 1,000 players ever managing to beat it, leading the game down a path of failure. Apart from the first character and hero Han Chang-woo, no one else had finished the game, except for one player who succeeded using the character Yu Bake. That player was the only one who pulled it off, though even he had started to grow bored of the game. While checking the chat room dedicated to those who had completed the game, he found no one else online. He recalled that not long ago, more than 10 people had been active there. He began to wonder whether the game had lost its popularity, or if the others had simply moved to a different chat room without telling him. As he sat there alone, a notification popped up. A member named Supreme Lord had joined the room. He then realized this was the chat room's leader. The leader expressed his surprise that someone was still inside, even though he had already removed everyone else. He admitted he hadn't expected to find anyone there. Then, recalling a promise he had made, he said he had to fulfill it. He asked the young man whether he would accept a bet, explaining that if he completed the game using a character of his choosing, he would be granted a wish of his own choosing. The young man laughed and asked if the wish could make him handsome or rich. To his surprise, the leader confirmed that such a wish could indeed be granted, if that's what he wanted. The young man asked what would happen if he failed to complete the game as instructed, and the chat room leader replied that he hadn't yet decided on a punishment, and that he'd only consider one if failure actually occurred. The young man found it strange that there was no punishment set, and the whole situation felt oddly unsettling. The leader then asked if he had previously finished the game using all the characters. The young man was about to type that he had, but paused. He hesitated, worried that the leader might steal credit for his achievements and boast about them first. So, he erased what he had written and decided to lie. He typed that he had completed the game with all the characters, except Yu Bake. The leader responded that he would verify this claim, but quickly changed his mind, saying there was no need. No sane person would ever try to finish the game with every single character anyway. He asked once more whether the young man would accept the bet. Although the whole situation still felt off, the young man agreed. He had nothing to lose, even if it turned out to be some elaborate trick. The leader told him that he was the last person left in the room, and for that reason, he considered him the best among all the players so far. The young man smiled, admitting that he truly was the best. He had finished the game using its most difficult and final character. That's why he didn't fear the bet, regardless of which character the leader might assign to him. But in that very moment, something suddenly felt wrong. Everything around him began to shake, the world blurring before his eyes, and he was struck by an intense dizziness he couldn't explain. The leader then warned him, this was no longer just a game, but a reality he would now live for himself. The young man vanished from his chair, leaving only his clothes behind. The leader added that everything that had happened was by the young man's own choice. He had agreed to this fate from the very beginning. When the young man opened his eyes, he was stunned by where he found himself. A snow-covered forest stretched out in every direction, and he had no idea how he'd gotten there. He ran his hand through his hair, wondering if it had always been this long. But his train of thought was abruptly broken when several people suddenly appeared in front of him. One of them stepped forward, saying they were glad to have finally found him, and addressed him as Mr. Bake. The young man recognized him. It was Shin Woo-hyun, and he wondered if he was dreaming. He couldn't understand how he was now standing face to face with a character from inside the game. The other man introduced himself as Shin Woo-hyun and asked if training would begin today as usual. Everything about Shin's speech matched his behavior in the game. Then, without warning, he apologized, explaining that today's training would be far harsher than anything before, because Yu Bake's older brother had ordered him to kill him. The young man instantly noticed a hidden weapon flying toward him. He couldn't dodge it completely. It sliced through his arm. He grabbed it in pain, trying to stop the bleeding, unable to believe how real this dream felt. Shin apologized again, saying his target had been Beck's heart, and he hadn't expected Beck to twist his body just enough to partially evade the strike. He added that despite Beck's weakened state, the blood of the Sword Saint still flowed within him, but that wouldn't change the outcome. Beck would die, because his continued survival only brought shame to the clan. He finished by promising a painless death, since Beck had once been his master, the one who trained him his entire life. It was at that moment that the young man realized this was real. It wasn't a game anymore, as he had once believed, yet he had no idea how he ended up in this position. He knew this wasn't the time for questions. One mistake now could mean real death, so he decided that the best thing he could do was stay calm and think clearly. But the pain from his wound was so intense, he could feel the blood dripping down his arm, blocking out all rational thought. The only thing he was certain of now was that this wasn't a dream, though he still had no clue how he'd gotten here, or why all of this was happening to him. He was suddenly struck by a memory, the chat room leader's final message, in which he warned that this was no longer just a game, but a reality he would truly experience. He began recalling the subtle clues he had noticed since opening his eyes in this strange place, the unusual length of his hair, and the situation where he was being chased by Shin. He started to wonder if he had actually become Yu Baek, the weakest and most difficult character in the game. He told himself that figuring out how it happened didn't matter right now. What mattered was finding a way to survive this mess. He had to remember the countless attempts he'd made in the past to beat the game using Yu Baek. He reminded himself that the first thing Baek must do at the start of his journey is escape as fast as possible, so he took off running like a hunted animal. Shin appeared shocked by what had just happened and didn't have time to say anything. It wasn't long before Shin managed to catch up and struck Beck in the legs, sending him crashing to the ground, unable to move another step. Shin told him that if escape had been his goal, he should have tried much harder, adding that a willing death would make things easier for everyone. Beck began thinking of how to buy more time until the moment he was waiting for arrived. Shin mocked him, saying he wouldn't die alone. His servants, including Choi Seong-woo, would be eliminated afterward. Then he asked if Beck had any last words. The warriors accompanying Shin were surprised when the snowstorm suddenly intensified. Beck stood up and declared his final words, "Go to hell." Shin was taken aback by his tone, demanding he repeat himself. But at that moment, a massive wolf appeared beside him and lunged at him. Shin managed to kill the beast with ease, coming out unscathed despite the sudden attack. He identified the creature as an ice wolf, but couldn't understand how it ended up here. He wondered if it had followed Beck's earlier screams. He was even more surprised to hear his comrades shouting behind him. Turning around, he saw a whole pack of ice wolves descending upon his team. He realized most of the warriors with him were still children, useless in the long run if they couldn't even handle a small pack like this. Shin decided he had to deal with the wolves quickly, but it would be smarter to eliminate Beck first. However, when he turned back to Beck's spot, he found it empty. Beck had vanished. The blizzard quickly spread across the forest, aiding Beck's escape from his pursuers. Beck was later seen resting under a tree, trying to stop the bleeding. He groaned in pain, wondering if he had mixed the herbs incorrectly. Suddenly, a system window appeared, informing him that he had successfully created a new medicinal mixture thanks to his outstanding understanding of medicine, despite lacking formal skill in it. Another window popped up, stating that he had applied a healing ointment, and that his wounds would recover while granting him temporary resistance to the freezing cold. Beck started to feel relief in the wounded area, and when he lifted his hand, he noticed the wound healing at a remarkable pace. He felt reassured, knowing he had combined the right herbs at the last moment. He said this outcome was expected. There's no way he could forget the path of Baek, the path that had taken him 2 years to master in order to beat the game with that character. But as he remembered the brutal road ahead of him now, as Baek, he realized how deep the trouble he was in really was. He found himself cursing the luck that had landed him in this situation. He went on to explain that the Sword Saint clan, to which Beck belonged, resided on Mount Seorak in Korea. It was founded by a martial arts genius known as the God of Martial Arts, who played a pivotal role in resolving the gate incident long ago. Although the God of Martial Arts disappeared not long after the incident, the Sword Saint clan flourished thanks to the texts he left behind, eventually becoming a prestigious family in Korea. Yu Baek was one of the 5 children entitled to inherit the legacy of this great clan. Beck felt that what he had gone through so far was far more difficult than anything he had experienced while playing the game in the past. He acknowledged that he had managed to stop the bleeding and avoid freezing to death thanks to the herbal ointment he created, but noted that its effect would last no more than 30 minutes. There was no time to waste. Every decision he made now would shape his fate. From the message he had recently received, he realized that the Path of Heroes system was still active even after entering the game world. The moment he said status window, a screen appeared before him showing his current stats and skills. All of his stats were still at F rank, and he had no skills or abilities registered yet. Even though he had already known this, seeing it with his own eyes was jarring. He commented that he was nothing more than a walking scarecrow at this point. He went on to explain that Yu Baek's path was especially brutal, beginning with a serious injury, and that even a small mistake or lapse in caution would lead to his death, especially with someone hunting him. Although the appearance of the ice wolves may have bought him a bit of time, escaping Shin wouldn't be easy. Shin carried an artifact that allowed him to track Beck, making it only a matter of time before he was found. Beck wondered what he could possibly do to survive in this situation, especially when he had no powers or skills of his own. Then, he remembered there was one possible route out of this mess: the maze forest. Meanwhile, Shin's team had succeeded in eliminating the entire pack of ice wolves. Shin noticed the tracking artifact began glowing on its own. When he picked it up, he saw it pointing in a certain direction. He knew it was guiding him to Bayek, and he swore he would catch him this time and finish the job. However, the artifact was now pointing toward the maze forest, and Shin told his team to brace themselves, as entering that forest meant risking their lives. Shin wasn't thinking about survival. His mind was fixated on the position he would gain if recognized by Yu Tairang, even if it meant sacrificing his entire squad. Beck, on the other hand, was still running through the maze forest. He explained that in the world of Path of Heroes, monsters were humanity's primary enemies, hunted down by professional hunters. The level of difficulty varied greatly depending on the type of portal and the kind of monsters that emerged from it. Monsters were classified into easy, difficult, and dangerous categories. As he ran, Beck suddenly noticed something ahead and quickly hid behind a tree. He noted that there was one area all hunters considered extremely dangerous and avoided at all costs: Mount Siorak. That was where he spotted a massive mountain serpent. The sight filled him with intense anxiety. He described the place as a living nightmare, where the treacherous terrain had become a haven for monsters that had built their own ecosystem. He kept watching the serpent until it finally disappeared from view. He pointed out that Mount Siorak was not a place Yu Beck could survive in with his current weak stats. He shouldn't have been able to get here without a guardian. The only reason he had ended up in this place was because of his mentor, Shin Woo-hyun, who supported a different brother as heir to the clan. As the master who had raised Bayek since childhood, Shin had been tasked with dealing with him in his brother's absence, so he had brought Beck to the heights of Mount Siorak to eliminate him. Beck explained that the standard early game strategy for Yu Beck required the player to survive the snowy field first, then return to the clan. But now, he had found the true goal he'd been searching for on this mountain, the very reason he hadn't gone back and had kept wandering until now. The reason was that Mount Siorak held a secret yet to be revealed, a secret buried deep within the maze forest at its center. At the entrance to the forest, carved into a stone, were the words, "Those unprepared to risk their lives, those lacking ice-cold composure and a far-reaching vision, turn back now." Soon after, Shin and his team arrived at the stone marking the entrance to the maze forest. One of the warriors asked if Shin truly intended to enter, his face showing clear signs of worry. Many had died after entering the forest the wrong way. Shin replied that he understood their concerns, but they had to confirm Bayek's death. He reassured them that there was no need to worry about getting lost, since they carried an artifact given by the young master Yu Tairang that would help them return. Still, he admitted there was one thing that continued to bother him. He wondered if Yu Beck had really grown bold enough to take such a risk, as if he were a completely different person from the one he used to know. He told his men that Bayek had started moving again, noting that the snow barely covered his footprints, which meant he had passed through recently and couldn't have gone far. He stressed that Bayek should be eliminated the moment they found him, then added that Master Shin had decided to move in that direction now. Sure enough, Shin and his team began making their way through the mountain in search of Bayek, but one of his subordinates called out to him, saying that it felt like they were walking in circles and asking if he was sure this was the right path. Shin asked if she had forgotten where they were, and she admitted she didn't fully understand what he meant. He explained that they were inside the maze forest, a place where no one could be certain if they were heading the right way or endlessly wandering in loops. Some people kept moving through it hundreds or even thousands of times without finding a way out, only to die inside. That was the nature of this forest. If someone wasn't ready to die while navigating it, then it was better to never lower their guard. At that very moment, Beck was still struggling to escape the forest. He felt on the verge of death, completely drained, and it was in times like these that he truly understood the value of healing herbs. But fear gripped him, and for some reason, it didn't feel like just a passing dread. He genuinely believed he might die here. That thought made him remember Supreme Lord, the one who had brought him to this place in the first place. He wondered if that man should have at least warned him about what was coming. Beck felt as if he'd been tricked, but in the end, he had to admit that it had been his own decision. He had chosen to come here. He had even lied about finishing the game, but none of that mattered anymore. Yu Beck felt that his endurance had reached its absolute limit. After using up every bit of strength he had left, he began looking around for the location he'd been searching for all this time, and at last, he found it. He had reached the edge of the maze forest, the destination he'd been chasing all along. Beck recalled that the first time he got here, he had felt only despair. He'd thought he had finally escaped the forest, but what he found instead was a steep cliff. Back then, he had felt like all his time had been wasted, but now, that memory was his greatest asset. From this point on, he had to maintain full focus. Just then, Shin and his team arrived at the exact spot where Beck was standing. Master Shin told him he was impressed that he had run all this way to reach this point, only to end up at a cliff. After all that running, it seemed his efforts had led him nowhere, and this was where his resistance would end. Beck asked him why he was doing this. Was it because he had truly become nothing more than a dog for Tairang? Shin replied that it was foolish of him to only now realize that. He had decided long ago to support Lord Tairang, because it was his power and skill that the Sword Saint clan needed right now. Yu Beck had been searching for confirmation that this was unfolding exactly as it had in the game, and Shin's words were all he needed to confirm his suspicions. Now that he was sure of what was happening, any hesitation would be reckless and dangerous. Every second of delay might bring death by freezing. But then, suddenly, he felt a crushing weight in his body. He lost his balance and collapsed. The cold wasn't his biggest concern anymore. It was the severe bleeding that now posed the deadliest threat. Shin told him they had wasted enough time talking, and judging by Beck's current condition, it looked like he might die before even managing to raise his sword. But since he was, as he put it, a kind-hearted man, he wouldn't leave Beck here to die slowly and painfully alone. Instead, he would grant him a quick death, the final act of mercy Beck would receive before the end. Beck, with a frail, exhausted voice, replied that it was a kind gesture from Shin, and before dying, he said there was something Shin should know. The artifact hanging from the chain around his neck could only be used once. The moment Shin heard those words, he launched forward with a brutal attack, swinging a powerful slash at Bayek. Bayek tried to leap away, but the strike landed deep in his side, sending him tumbling off the cliff. Shin and his men were convinced Beck had died on impact. Shin declared that retrieving the body was no longer possible, so they could leave now, though he knew Lord Terang might not believe the story. When Shin tried to activate the artifact hanging from his necklace, he discovered it no longer worked. Panic struck him, and he realized Beck had been telling the truth. Just then, strange creatures began emerging from the depths of the forest, drawn by the scent of fresh human blood. Beck, meanwhile, had survived the fall, though his body was badly injured and he was bleeding heavily. Suddenly, a glowing book appeared before him, shimmering with a powerful light. This was what he had been searching for all along. Beck pleaded with the book to heal him and restore his body, but he lost consciousness mid-sentence. At that moment, a system window appeared, informing him that his request had been registered and would be executed immediately. A glowing light surrounded Bayek and lifted him into the air, beginning the process of healing his severe wounds. When Beck opened his eyes, they were glowing with a brilliant light, and he began witnessing the memories of the book's original author. He learned that the man had one lifelong wish: to make martial arts techniques in this world accessible to everyone. However, as he aged, it became impossible for him to fulfill that dream on his own. So, he left this book behind, designed to record every technique that would emerge in the world. This was his final will, for whoever found the book to use it for that purpose alone. Beck witnessed the author's memories and vowed to use the book for good and in the right way. The system then notified Beck that after obtaining the book, all his stats had been raised, and his injuries were completely healed. He could feel the change. His body had recovered from every serious wound he had suffered, and he was filled with joy at finally reaching the book he had been chasing. Beck's excitement wasn't just because of the rank increase. It was also because he now possessed a powerful and invaluable artifact. He began to reflect on how the path of heroes never gave anything away for free. There were no preloaded levels. Skills and abilities had to be earned through grueling trials and harsh training. It was a path not to be underestimated. One of the most brutal routes in the game was known as Yu Taijin's path, famous for its extreme difficulty, and the only way to overcome it was by possessing unique skills and powers. This was what had driven Bayek to risk everything to reach this point. The first trait he decided to examine was Supreme Combat Physique, a trait that accelerated ability growth, mastery of all techniques, and even allowed learning new skills at times, in addition to significantly enhancing strength. The problem, however, was that the trait was currently inactive, despite its immense potential to aid his progress. Finally, it was time to inspect the Heavenly Martial Arts book he had just acquired. This book granted the owner unique abilities that no one else could obtain. These were skills that couldn't be learned through training, shared, or copied by anyone else. Beck remembered the special ability he had seen. Thanks to this book, he could learn any skill that existed in this world, not just martial arts techniques, but also any fantasy or supernatural skill, as long as it was combat-related at its core. Beck felt his luck wasn't exactly shining. He had no idea how to use alchemy or magic. Still, he knew there were ways he could learn both eventually. But before anything else, a notification appeared, and he realized the most urgent task was to check how the points he earned had been distributed. Upon opening the system window, he saw that the points had gone into triple blade technique, charge technique, and spear throwing skills. Beck thought these didn't suit his current situation. Sword skills were of no use to him right now, given his condition. Getting into a fight would be suicide, so he didn't need them at the moment. One skill, however, caught his attention: movement skill, a martial art that lightens the body, improving speed, agility, and reflexes. Beck realized this was an essential skill, useful in both escape and combat, and something that could benefit him in countless situations down the line. Once he fully mastered the Heavenly Martial Arts book, he'd be able to pull off some truly remarkable feats. But for now, one thing remained: choosing a new quest. When he opened the quest list, 2 missions appeared: Catch Me If You Can, and Sorry Ancestor, I'll Be a Thief, just for today. Beck considered which one to pick. The second title seemed odd and inappropriate, but in the end, he decided to go with it. The moment he accepted, a hidden door opened at the spot where he had been standing, and Beck sensed that accepting this quest would lead him into a maze-like passage. If he could make it through, he'd receive an early reward at the end of the path, which, without a doubt, would be the treasure of the martial arts leader's tomb. He laughed, saying it wasn't exactly a hard conclusion to reach. At that moment, he recalled Master Shin and wondered what might be happening to them now. As for Shin, his situation was grim. The creatures that had suddenly emerged from the forest depths were now tearing through his followers one by one, while he hid atop a tree branch. But even that wasn't enough to protect him from the climbing monsters. He was struck by a deadly attack from a giant serpent, then vanished from the tree entirely. Beck wasn't sure whether Shin had managed to escape the forest maze or not. He knew it wasn't easy to get out of there alive. Meanwhile, Beck was busy gathering various items he thought he might need. He assumed he now had everything essential. Among his collection were Sky Herb, Flame Spirit Herb, and Fire Ginger. Apparently, all he required. As he scanned the area, he spotted a large wooden chest. He figured that opening it might signal the successful completion of his quest. Upon opening the chest, a notification popped up stating he had obtained a 100-year-old snow ginseng, along with a treasure collector's pouch. With that, he had collected all the tomb's treasures and completed the quest, earning 500 points, and the White Demon. The martial arts leader's tomb would now be destroyed as the quest was finished. Beck found the system designers to be eccentric and overly imaginative. Who would expect a tomb to be hidden beneath a cliff? But he understood that the harder the location, the greater the reward, especially since this mission had granted him an incredible item like the White Demon. Back at the Sword Saint clan's gatepost, one of the guards was sitting idly playing video games. When he suddenly felt someone standing outside the gate, he looked out the window and saw none other than Mr. Beck. He asked what he wanted, and Beck replied that he needed him to summon Choi Seong-min immediately and tell him to come at once. The next day, Choi Seong-min asked Dr. Jo Jung-won if Beck would remain unconscious for much longer. The doctor replied that he couldn't say for sure. The injury Beck had suffered wasn't just an ordinary wound. Seong-min asked what that meant. If it wasn't a normal injury, then what was it exactly? Jo Jung-won admitted that he didn't know precisely what had affected Beck. There were no visible wounds, and honestly, Beck appeared to be in better health than before. Seong-min remarked that he didn't look comfortable at all, to which the doctor responded that he might just be having a nightmare or something similar. At that moment, Beck suddenly woke up, startled, with sweat pouring down his face and clear fear in his eyes. Seong-min told him he was glad he'd come back to consciousness, and Dr. Jo expressed relief now that Beck's condition seemed stable. Beck looked at them both in confusion and disbelief, muttering that what he'd experienced felt like a dream within a dream. Still unable to believe what was happening, he rushed to the window and threw it open, staring out at the courtyard of the Sword Saint clan estate. There, the trainees were practicing as usual, talking about daily matters like gates, dungeons, and monsters. Beck asked where he was, and Dr. Jo Jung-won told him this was the Sword Saint clan's headquarters, his home. Upon hearing that, Beck's heart sank. It meant what he had experienced wasn't a dream or fantasy, but his new reality. Dr. Jo commented that Bayek still looked disoriented and asked if he was in pain. Bayek said he had a slight headache. The doctor told him he needed medicine and left to retrieve it, while Seong-min said he'd go fetch some food. But Beck called out before he left. Seong-min asked if he needed something else, and Beck said he just wanted to know what day it was. Seong-min replied that Beck had been asleep for 4 days, so today was the 15th. Beck then asked for the year, and Seong-min told him it was January 2035. That confirmed it for Beck. Everything he had gone through was real. He had simply made it back home alive. Shortly after, Seong-min returned with food, and Baek, overwhelmed by hunger, immediately began to eat while pondering his next steps. He had returned home, just as he'd wished, but that didn't make this place any safer than the frozen plains he had survived. After all, this was the Sword Saint clan's stronghold, a place where everyone fought for power and position. There was no escaping the brutal reality that the children of powerful clans would fight each other for the right to rule. Yu Tairang, the eldest son, Yu Jungyeon, the eldest daughter, Yu Kang-ho, the third son, Yu Min, the fourth daughter, and finally, Baek Jun, the youngest. 3 other children had once existed, but Yu Tairang had killed them. This kind of internal power struggle wasn't uncommon among siblings, but it had now reached the point where Tairang's claim to leadership was nearly guaranteed, and it seemed that his siblings had mostly accepted it. Yu Kang-ho, known for his quick wit and reflexes, had joined Tairang's side. Yu Jungyeon had more or less given up on becoming heir, and Yu Min never showed any interest in the succession at all. So why had Tairang killed 3 of his siblings? The only possible reason was that he refused to leave any chance of failure in his plans. To sum it all up, Beck had concluded that Yu Tairang was the main antagonist in this story, and since today was January 15th, 2035, that aligned with the timeline he remembered, meaning that in just 2 years, their father, Yu Muhak, would pass leadership of the clan to Tairang. If Beck didn't act quickly, his fate would be sealed by his own brother's hands. Beck stepped out of the room, prompting Seong-min to ask where he was going when he hadn't fully recovered yet. But Beck didn't respond. His mind was fixated on a single thought. If he wanted to change his fate, he needed to become stronger and earn the clan's recognition. And since he was now in the Sword Saint clan, it meant there were many great masters who could train him. What he needed first was strength and skill. The place Beck chose to visit was Dr. Jo Young-won's chamber. He knocked and asked to come in, apologizing for entering so suddenly without permission. He explained that he had searched for the doctor downstairs and couldn't find him, so he came up to the upper floor. Then he asked if he could stay and observe for a while. The doctor asked if he meant watching him work, and Beck confirmed, saying he wanted to spend some time there, and that he was also curious about his current condition. Beck knew that Jo Jung-won had served the clan since the previous leader's era, and was renowned for his exceptional healing skills and rare techniques. He also knew the doctor was indifferent to the clan's internal power struggles, caring only for herbs and medicine. Because of that, he had never taken a disciple. Although he had the ability to teach, he never had a suitable student. His loyalty and the clan members' lack of interest in pharmacy left him with no real options. But Baek wanted to try. He hoped he could change the doctor's mind, especially since he wanted to create an elixir to help him grow stronger. And to do that, he needed Jo Jung-won's help. His unique medical knowledge would be essential. The doctor sighed, saying that he'd slowed down a bit due to age. But Beck responded that he didn't see that as a problem at all. The doctor then asked if he wasn't just here for medicine. Did he truly care about pharmacy and herbs? Beck said yes, adding that he had been studying the subject on his own through books for a long time. Then, inhaling the room's scent, he remarked that it was, without a doubt, a mix of peace herb and dream flower. Based on the aroma, he guessed the medicine the doctor was preparing was for headaches and mental clarity. Dr. Jo was stunned and asked how Beck had figured that out just from the scent. Beck replied that it would be difficult to learn such things from books alone. That's why he tasted the herbs he read about, and once he tasted one, he never forgot its scent. He then added that he also smelled something odd, likely screaming herb, a toxic plant. The doctor was shocked again and admitted Baek was completely right. Baek continued, explaining that while screaming herb was indeed poisonous, it lost its toxicity when burned, becoming a medicinal component useful in prescriptions. The doctor was astonished once more, beginning to think that Baek wasn't just talented in combat. What he was saying now made him wonder whether, if Baek weren't a Sword Saint clan descendant, he might have treated him very differently. Baek then asked if the doctor had any idea what had happened to him, what led him to appear in the state Seongmin had found him in. The doctor replied that he'd heard Baek had gone out alone for a walk and was attacked by monsters. That answer matched Baek's expectations. Clearly, the doctor knew nothing of Master Shin's assassination attempt in the icy plains. Baek went on to say that during that ordeal, he realized how vital herbs and medicine were. They could truly save lives in critical moments. He found it a shame that he couldn't study the subject properly and was left to only read about herbs. At that moment, Dr. Jo Young-won offered to take him on as a direct disciple, if, of course, Baek had no objection. Baek responded that it would no doubt be a great honor for him, though the truth was, he was busy nearly all day. Dr. Jo Young-won smiled and said he wasn't that busy, and if his student was to be none other than young Master Baek himself, then he'd be more than willing to set aside time just for him, even starting from the very basics. Baek replied that even just being offered the chance was an honor, and he was deeply grateful for the opportunity to learn from such a respected teacher. The doctor answered that the honor was his, not Baek's. At that moment, a new system quest appeared for Baek, stating that he now needed to become a pharmacist and apprentice to Dr. Jo Young-won. Baek thought it wouldn't be too difficult. If he simply spent some time learning from the doctor now and then, he'd probably complete the quest soon enough. Baek kept thinking that Dr. Jo Young-won was definitely someone he could trust, and the same went for his attendant, Seongmin, especially since Seongmin had some experience treating the clan's illnesses, though he lacked any martial skills and held the lowest servant rank because of it. Baek was certain that Seongmin would never betray him. That's when he resolved to consider carefully how to handle this new path. When Seongmin returned, he was surprised to see Baek preparing to train. He asked in disbelief if Baek was seriously planning to train. Then he asked why he was suddenly so eager. Baek replied that he couldn't stay in this place forever. That made Seongmin recall his father's harsh words, how he had called him weak and useless before kicking him out, saying someone that frail could never be his son. Seongmin knew well that the Sword Saint clan was like a kingdom of beasts. Strength was the law, and even blood ties didn't change that. Baek, for all his kindness, lacked talent in martial arts, the clan's ultimate measure of worth, and his gentle nature made him seem weak. He had grown up with that reputation, and everyone in the clan treated him like a helpless child who needed constant care. Baek was fully aware of how others saw him, and knew that if he hadn't been the son of the clan leader, he likely would have been cast out and left alone with nothing but his beloved books. That's why he resolved to use his weak body to train. He started running a long distance, telling himself defiantly that he could handle it. But he was shocked when his breath gave out almost instantly, and sweat poured down his face. Even though he hadn't run far at all, he thought to himself, this can't be a normal body. He felt like he might actually die if he kept going. At that moment, a system window appeared, telling him he had completed the first step toward escaping obscurity. Baek collapsed and admitted it was much harder than he'd imagined, though he also felt the 6 hours he had spent training had yielded better results than expected. That meant things really were beginning to change, so he decided to use a technique he knew how to activate and move with properly, even though he'd never tried it before. The technique was called Shinggong, a martial art that lightened the body, boosted speed, reflexes, and enhanced balance. Baek felt a surge of joy. It really seemed to be working. It gave him the same sensation he'd felt when returning from the martial leader's tomb. It comforted him to know that he could use this skill whenever he needed. While Baek was in the middle of training, someone approached him from behind and said, "What's that smell?" Then added, "So that's where the stink was coming from." It was Yu Kang-ho, Baek's older brother, who sneered and said the foul odor came from his little brother, drenched in sweat just from a light bit of training. Baek replied calmly that it was nice to see Kang-ho again after such a long time, and explained that he had just been doing a bit of training. Kang scoffed and said they never met because Baek preferred to lock himself away in his room all day, then asked why he was suddenly training now of all times. He mocked him, questioning what good physical training could possibly do for an idiot like him. Baek was taken aback by his arrogance, especially considering Kang-ho wasn't that much stronger than him. Baek knew well that Yu Kang-ho wasn't just the third son of the Sword Saint clan, he was also infamous within the clan as a troublemaker. He was known for wasting money, his chaotic relationships with women, and the problems he caused every time he left the estate. Baek told him he had been training a little because he was recently attacked by monsters, and wanted to be prepared if something like that happened again. Kang laughed and said he was wasting his time. If Baek ever needed help, he should just ask him. Then, as he walked past him, Kang kicked Baek in the face, and smirked maliciously, saying that as his older brother, he'd be more than happy to help, just like he used to in the past. With that, Kang and his group left the training yard and quickly disappeared. They left Baek behind, seething with anger. He muttered under his breath that, to him, they were already dead. He wanted to punch Kang-ho in the face, but he held himself back, realizing this wasn't the time for revenge. It was time to build his strength. Just then, a new system window appeared with a quest titled First Steps Out of Weakness, requiring 3 hours of physical training. The reward, increased strength stats, and 50 points. Baek wasn't upset about getting another quest, even though he hadn't rested yet. In fact, he welcomed it. It was a perfect opportunity to push his physical limits. After finishing his training, Baek returned home and opened the Martial Gods book, looking for skills he could buy with his points. He purchased the skill Heavy Strike for 100 points, a move that allows him to charge his fist or weapon with mana and unleash a more powerful blow. He also bought Triple Talent Sword Technique for just 50 points, which helped him start learning mana control, though it was considered a basic sword skill. The third skill was Triple Talent Fist Technique, which also cost 50 points and taught him 3 basic combat moves: a low punch, a downward elbow strike, and an uppercut. Beck added up his points and noted that he had earned 500 from the Martial Leader's Tomb and 100 more from today's Weakling's Escape quest. Though his body was still sore, he was satisfied knowing he now had enough points to train again tomorrow and learn the skills he wanted. The skill he had his eyes on next was Trait Manifestation, a technique used by Yoon Chung-ha, an A-rank hunter. Though it was a top-tier skill, it cost only 500 points and allowed the user to channel excess mana into their blade. But it wasn't easy. It consumed a massive amount of mana. To solve that issue, Beck planned to use his 1,000-year-old Snow Ginseng to help him partially activate the technique. However, when he compared the 3 techniques he'd recently bought to Trait Manifestation, he found them all to be rather underwhelming. Still, he noted that even if those skills were pushed to their highest level, they would remain third-rate martial arts. Yet he needed them for a crucial event that was about to begin very soon. Beck continued his morning training consistently, determined to escape the label of weakness. And when he returned from each session, he shared his growing herbal knowledge generously with Dr. Jo Jung-won. Beck told Dr. Jo that the herb in his hand was called Baraji grass, and explained that it contained a paralytic toxin that could cause suffocation if consumed raw. He added that if the herb was boiled and properly dried before ingestion, it would instead provide the user with a significant energy boost. His explanation was interrupted by a look from Jo, one filled with joy and admiration, as if he had finally found the treasure he'd been seeking all his life, or the son he never had. After passing the herbal knowledge test set by the pharmacist Jo, Beck was finally able to purchase the skill Trait Manifestation on the 4th day of his relentless pursuit to escape weakness. He acquired the Herbal Medicine Preparation skill, Grade B, which gave him professional knowledge of medicine making and increased the effectiveness of his remedies by 1.5 times. Beck felt a surge of joy. His efforts over the past 2 days were beginning to bear fruit. He realized this skill could continue improving, and that the more he learned about herbs, the more effects his future medicines would carry. Jo told him he saw a true pharmacist in him, one whose talent surpassed most of the pharmacists he'd ever known. Beck also noticed that system windows appeared only to him, just like in the game. He replied modestly, saying that everything he had achieved so far was thanks to Jo's guidance and instructions. He then told Jo that he wanted to start crafting medicine and asked if he would help. Jo seemed surprised there was a remedy complicated enough to require his assistance, and asked what kind of medicine Beck was planning to make. The surprise came when Beck revealed a golden ginseng root estimated to be over 1,000 years old. He also laid out Sun Herb, Flame Spirit Herb, and Fire Ginseng. Jo tensed and asked if these were the reason Bayek had been attacked by monsters recently. Bayek apologized for not telling him the truth from the beginning. Jo understood and said he would have done the same if he were in Bayek's shoes. He acknowledged that 1,000-year-old Snow Ginseng would definitely tempt others. Bayek thanked him for understanding and said he had never seen this type of ginseng before, but the aura radiating from it confirmed that it was indeed over 1,000 years old. Jo asked what kind of remedy Beck intended to prepare using these herbs. Beck replied that he wanted to make a yang enhancement pill, one strong enough to suppress the overwhelming yin energy contained within the 1,000-year-old Snow Ginseng. Jo grasped what he meant and asked if he was joking, but Beck answered seriously that he truly intended to consume the Snow Ginseng. Jo said he had heard about Bayek's intense training over the past few days, and asked if everything he'd done so far had been in preparation for this moment. Then, without hesitation, he agreed to help him begin crafting the medicine. Beck spent the entire day at Jo's side, working together to prepare the remedy, using his newly acquired skill to enhance the quality of the treatment. Eventually, they succeeded in creating the Supreme Yang Pill, a powerful pill infused with high-level Yang energy, crafted by a skilled pharmacist. Beck sat on the floor with the Supreme Yang Pill in front of him, next to the 1,000-year-old Snow Ginseng, amazed that the herbs he had received as a reward from clearing the martial god's tomb would be used in such a way. Jo told him he'd be monitoring him throughout the process and would call for help immediately if things got dangerous. Beck agreed and said he'd ask for help if he felt overwhelmed. Then he reached for the Supreme Yang Pill, taking it piece by piece, and soon felt an inferno ignite within his body. Jo grew worried upon seeing Bayek's condition. Yang energy surged violently throughout his system, and the agony of the experience was clear on his face. As for Bayek, he felt as if flames were blazing inside him, but he was determined to endure it. There was no room for hesitation now. He waited as the Yang energy slowly began to circulate through his body. Beck suddenly felt he could no longer withstand the overwhelming Yang energy surging through him. He had to calm it somehow. He grabbed the 1,000-year-old Snow Ginseng and began eating it rapidly. Almost immediately, a chilling cold began to spread through his body, extinguishing the flames that had been blazing inside him. But in the next moment, an even more powerful wave of yin energy erupted and surged through his entire system. It felt as though the yin energy would freeze all of his energy pathways. Beck knew that if he didn't calm it down carefully, it could explode inside him. Dr. Jo grew visibly worried as Beck screamed in pain, the yin energy pouring from his body and flooding the room. Jo declared they couldn't wait any longer. They needed help immediately. But then, he noticed Beck beginning to calm down gradually. activating a cultivation technique to stabilize his energy flow and regain control of his inner circuits. Still, Joe observed that the technique Bayek was using was incredibly crude, certainly not one befitting a noble clan like the Sword Saint clan. Bayek explained that the three-element technique, while basic and seemingly worthless, allowed users to gradually learn how to control mana. With time, Beck managed to suppress the yin energy he had absorbed from the snow ginseng, and his expression slowly shifted into one of visible relief and stability. Joe said he could hardly believe what he was witnessing. He never imagined that the weak young master Yu Bayek would be cultivating, let alone that he would manage to digest a 1,000-year-old snow ginseng. Beck opened his eyes, and in them was a gleam that hadn't been there before. His energy had clearly increased far beyond what it had been. After fully absorbing the ginseng, Beck left Joe's chamber. On his way out, he remembered how Joe had asked him earlier about the technique he used, and where he had learned it. Beck replied that he had simply copied someone after seeing it once. Joe believed him without hesitation, and felt reassured that choosing Beck as his disciple had not been a mistake. Beck figured that was explanation enough. It wouldn't cause any future trouble. Still, he knew Joe would likely start overestimating him from now on. Beck felt more prepared than ever to face what lay ahead. He opened his status window to check his latest progress. All of his stats had risen. Most notably, his mana rank had jumped 2 full levels to reach rank B. He was thrilled, especially since the new passive effect he'd gained from the elixir would now help him recover from exhaustion much faster. He decided to test the trait manifestation technique using the energy he had gathered. He explained that this skill had been created by the magic swordswoman, Yoon Seong-ha. It was designed to channel excess mana into her blade, combining both elemental and core mana to unleash powerful energy blades. He remembered that Yoon Seong-ha was one of the major figures mentioned in Path of Heroes, renowned for her unique ability called Dragon Heart, a special core that generated mana at an astonishing rate. Beck gathered all his energy and activated trait manifestation, then struck the ground with force. A wide wave of ice element energy erupted around him, fueled by the yin energy now coursing through his body. He said the skill was exactly as powerful as he had expected. It was, after all, an A-rank ability. Suddenly, Beck collapsed to the ground, completely drained. The mana cost of a single strike had been far greater than he anticipated. Still, he admitted it made sense. Trait manifestation had been created specifically by Seong-ha to unleash the vast mana reserves her body could produce. Normally, he wouldn't have dared use it, but the 1,000-year-old snow ginseng had allowed him to pull it off at his current level. He wondered where Yoon Seong-ha might be now, probably in the United States. He thought to himself that meeting her someday would be quite something. Then he added, the time had come to prepare for the first major event. The scene shifted to Bayek's private quarters, where Seong-min entered and informed him that his breakfast was ready. He also mentioned that he hadn't been sleeping well lately, since Bayek had started waking up far too early these past few days. Bayek asked if anything new had happened in the clan this morning. Seong-min answered that today was Sunday, and the clan's elders would be personally overseeing training today. Seong-min told Bayek that they had asked if he wanted to join the family's observation as usual, but he had declined, just like he always had since he was young. This time, however, Bayek replied that he would attend, surprising Seong-min, who couldn't understand what had changed so suddenly. Beck simply said it was only natural. After all, he was family by blood. He then ordered Seong-min to inform them of his decision and to hurry, since there was only 1 hour left until the gathering. Beck and Seong-min headed together toward the training grounds. It was clear Seong-min was nervous. His last experience attending one of these events hadn't been pleasant. The clan's warriors were stunned to see Yu Beck show up. They couldn't believe he was actually attending the morning family training session. Beck overheard their comments, but paid them no mind. They didn't care whether he heard or not. Beck explained internally that the Sword Saint clan had a long-standing tradition. Every Sunday morning, all the trainees gathered for group training. The session was overseen by the clan's top instructors and masters, and nearly all family members were expected to attend. Yet, Beck had always seen it as largely meaningless. Among those usually present was the clan leader himself, and today was the first time Beck had seen the patriarch face to face. That was when we were introduced to the current leader of the Sword Saint clan, Yu Muhak, who stood flanked by the clan's elders and senior trainers. Beck was caught off guard when someone called out to him. Turning around, he found a young woman asking if he was all right, having heard about the recent monster attack. It was none other than Yu Jung-yeon, the clan's eldest daughter. Beck thanked her for her concern and smiled, saying he had recovered thanks to pharmacist Joe's help. But the moment was interrupted by someone seated beside Jung-yeon, who scoffed and said Beck was useless. It was Kang, who stared at Beck in disgust, and said it was shameful for someone like him to even belong to the Sword Saint clan. He added that even a minor monster attack nearly killed him. Beck told himself he had to endure the insults, so he distracted his thoughts with happier ones to keep himself calm. His eyes caught a girl sitting beside Kang, who didn't even spare him a glance. He immediately recognized her as Yu Min, the clan's 4th daughter. Kang continued mocking him, saying he'd heard Beck had been hanging around the pharmacy lately. He asked if Beck had resorted to medicine because he lacked talent in swordsmanship. Sneering, he added that it suited him, since he'd always just sat around reading books. At that point, Beck's patience snapped. He decided to abandon his original plan and bring the first major event forward. Kang snarled, "You weak little bastard, sit down. I'll teach you swordsmanship myself, and maybe the taste of death while I'm at it." Beck calmly told him to shove his tongue back in his mouth and keep it shut. The clan members were stunned by what he said, their full attention now locked on Bayek. Kang was in disbelief, asking Bayek to repeat what he had just said. Bayek answered that Kang's breath had reached him from across the courtyard, and asked what kind of rotting trash he'd been eating to make it that bad. Kang was completely floored by Beck's boldness, and couldn't believe he'd said such things in public. Before walking away, Beck added that if Kang's mouth was really a flower, he should use it to brush his teeth properly, and not forget to scrub his tongue too. Young-yeon tried to hold back her laughter, clearly enjoying this new side of Bayek. Kang, meanwhile, couldn't muster a comeback. He clenched his fists, trying to hold in his rage, but suddenly he snapped, yelling that he'd kill Beck right there and then if that's what he wanted. Yet, his fury was cut short when he saw Beck turn away and approach the clan leader, Yu Muhak, before kneeling in front of him. Beck stepped forward and requested to be taught martial arts by the clan leader himself, thus beginning his first main quest. Muhak replied coldly, saying there was no place in this world for someone like Beck, who lacked both talent and even the desire to pursue martial arts. Beck, however, looked up and said he'd suddenly found himself very interested in it. Muhak said he remembered how Beck had always refused to learn a skill meant for killing, even as a child, and asked what had changed his mind now. Beck replied that those words had once made sense, but his perspective had shifted after coming face to face with death. He added that dying without purpose meant nothing, and if he had to survive to the end, it was better to become the one who kills, not the one who gets killed. Hearing that Bayek had abandoned his foolish ideals, Muhak asked what he wanted exactly. Bayek responded that he wished to be trained by one of the 4 great masters. The masters themselves were visibly surprised by the request. Kang immediately objected, saying that someone as worthless as Bayek didn't deserve such a privilege, and that even a stray dog would laugh at such nonsense. Muhak added that Bayek's talent was so minimal it could hardly be called talent at all, and that was a serious problem. Training him would be a waste of everyone's time. He went on to say that he wouldn't approve of wasting the great master's efforts on Bayek, nor even those of the regular instructors. Beck replied by asking, "What if I prove I do have talent?" Muhak waited to hear how he planned to do that, but Beck had already anticipated the conversation would reach this point, so he told Muhak that he would prove he had enough potential to be trained by the great masters, and asked how he could prove it. Beck glanced behind him, then declared that in just 1 week, he would face Kang in the training arena, and he intended to defeat him. Kang exploded in rage, asking if Beck thought this was some kind of joke. How could he possibly believe he could win when he hadn't even learned a proper combat art yet? Beck ignored him entirely and addressed Muhak again, asking for his opinion on the proposal. Muhak agreed to grant him the opportunity, but warned that it would be his final chance. If he failed, he would be stripped of his position as a member of the Sword Saint clan. Beck accepted his father's condition without hesitation. He then headed straight to the training yard to begin preparations. He had only 1 week left until the duel. He knew that if he managed to defeat Kang within that time, the clan would allow him to be trained by a great master, and he'd also earn a rare skill as a base reward for the event. A magical training dummy appeared before him, one that could move and react to attacks if infused with energy. Beck told himself that he was going to teach Kang a lesson he would never forget. Some of the Sword Saint clan's warriors stood around watching Beck train, surprised that someone as weak as him was actually practicing seriously. One of them whispered that he'd heard Beck had once cried and run off when Kang trained him. Another said he hoped to see a repeat of that moment, and they began betting on how long Beck would last before giving up. Meanwhile, Beck was training with the Samgai Fist, a combat style typically learned by thugs in alleyways. It consisted of 3 core moves: the elbow strike, the uppercut, and the straight punch. He landed a heavy elbow on the dummy, sending it flying, then dashed after it using the light step technique, and followed up with a powerful blow using heavy strike, which allowed him to channel energy into his fist or weapon, and unleash his full strength. The impact was so strong that it completely shattered the dummy. But someone was watching him from the upper platform overlooking the training yard. The woman didn't interfere, she merely observed, curiosity driving her to see what techniques Beck had acquired, and which ones he planned to use to defeat Kang. By the 3rd day of Bayek's intense training, the woman was still watching, having observed him for 2 full days now. Yet she remarked that nothing he had shown so far was particularly impressive. All she had seen was constant running, the repeated use of light step, and his fights with the training dummy using Samgai Fist. The woman continued watching Beck closely, unable to understand how he could keep running for so long while using light step without pause. Even more puzzling was the way his posture hadn't shifted a single time, despite the constant movement. It was clear to her now that he possessed a suspiciously advanced command of the technique. She found herself wondering what had driven him to choose martial arts over any other path. Her thoughts were interrupted by one of the clan's grand masters, who asked if something was troubling her. She replied that there was no need for concern. He then asked if she was still firm in her decision, to which she politely thanked him for the suggestion, and confirmed that she had no intention of changing her mind. He tried once more to persuade her, saying things would be easier if she supported Yu Tairang, but she calmly cut him off, asking him to take care of himself, ending the conversation. Meanwhile, in the training yard, Beck was still practicing non-stop even as night fell. The field was filled with broken training dummies, casualties of his relentless effort. He found genuine satisfaction in training with them. They had managed to endure his constant strikes for far longer than expected. Beck admitted to himself that he had been worried things might not unfold like the story he remembered, but his fears were misplaced. It was all thanks to the 1,000-year-old snow ginseng. Without it, he would have collapsed and ended up in the hospital long ago. Then, he was startled by a voice calling out to him from behind. He turned to see the source of the voice. It was Li Han Seong Ah. She asked if he was all right and offered him a handkerchief to wipe his sweat. As she approached, Beck began explaining the hierarchy of the Sword Saint clan. At the top was the clan leader, followed by his direct bloodline, then the Grand Masters, the instructors, and finally the trainees. He added that Grand Masters and instructors usually supported whichever heir they favored, and that the larger the faction, the more intense the rivalry became. That was normal in any powerful clan. Among the instructors, however, there were a few who remained neutral. Seong Ah was one of the most prominent. Beck was genuinely glad she had finally come to speak with him. He asked what she meant when she'd asked if he was okay, and accepted the handkerchief with a grateful smile. Seong-ah explained that young Master Kang had trained under the clan's greatest masters for years. Beck asked if she was implying that it was reckless of him to challenge Kang when everyone expected him to lose. Seong-ah tried to deny it, but Beck gently insisted, saying she clearly meant it, and that he would have thought the same in her place. Then he clarified that he hadn't chosen to fight Kang on a whim. He had a plan. She asked if that plan involved using martial arts, and Beck could see a genuine curiosity in her eyes about that field. He knew that Seong-ah was far from a traditional instructor in the Sword Saint clan, unlike most who only focused on swordsmanship. She had a keen interest in other forms of combat as well. She wanted to use them to grow stronger. For example, she was particularly fond of magic, but due to her role as an instructor, she had always suppressed that interest. She wasn't supposed to have it in the first place, so it came as a shock when she saw a clan heir openly practicing martial arts. She warned Bayek that in the Sword Saint clan, one wasn't even supposed to consider learning anything outside swordsmanship, let alone pursue it. Beck asked her, who decided that, then added that the god of war, founder of the clan, had mastered swordsmanship, martial arts, spear techniques, and archery. So why would the clan he founded allow only the sword? Seong-ah had no answer to his logic. Beck asked her to listen carefully, and told her plainly that he had no intention of following such outdated traditions. He would learn whatever he could, and use whatever tools he found to become stronger. In his words, Seong-ah saw everything she had once wished she had the courage to pursue herself. Beck had, in truth, misled her a little. The only thing the god of martial arts had actually left behind was sword techniques. But Beck saw no reason to share that detail. As long as no one else knew the truth, there was no harm in letting her believe otherwise. Seong-ah told him that only someone like him, someone not bound by the clan's rigid training system, could have such a mindset. She admitted that although she felt unworthy, she wanted to ask for permission to train him herself. At last, Beck had succeeded in capturing her interest. Beck warned her that the clan looked down on him, and if she chose to train him, they might begin treating her differently as well. But she confessed she had always felt like an outsider in the family anyway, then apologized and suggested they help each other, since both of them were already outcasts in the eyes of others. Beck knew that if he had asked any other master, they would have come up with excuses to reject him. The only reason Seong-ah agreed was because she didn't care what others thought, and because she was also one of the most skilled instructors in the clan. He smiled and told her he'd gladly accept her offer to train under her, if she was willing. He accepted because he saw her not just as a hunter, but as someone with the potential to become a magic swordswoman like Yoon Seong-ha, especially since she had a natural gift for magic. Learning internal energy techniques would benefit her immensely. Seong-ah's expression changed suddenly. Now that she was his instructor, she ordered him not to move a step. Beck grew tense and suggested they start their training in the morning, since it was already late. But she asked if he really thought he could beat Kang with that kind of mindset, and Beck froze. He had forgotten how drastically Seong-ah's personality changed when it came to training. She had him sit down and told him she had modified the Flowing Sky Mind technique, one of the clan's basic arts, and would begin teaching it to him immediately. She explained that she would inject a small amount of mana into his body, and asked him to focus on how she controlled it. But the moment she began, she was stunned by the size of his dantian, his inner energy core, and finally understood how he had withstood Qinggong for so long. A dantian of that size simply shouldn't exist in someone just starting martial arts. Even beyond that, she could feel his life force, how balanced it was, and how well developed his physique had become. It didn't feel human at all. It felt as if it had descended from the heavens. Beck told her that he understood her control over mana and wanted to try it himself. She agreed to support him, but privately thought that mastering such a technique typically required hours of fine-tuned training, and Beck hadn't trained in martial arts at all until recently. Then suddenly, a bright light erupted, so intense it transformed her entire expression into one of shock. Her mind flashed back to the past, remembering how she used to mock the other instructors who chose to serve the clan heirs. She saw them as power-hungry opportunists, more interested in influence than passing down their martial knowledge. But what she saw in Yu Baek was completely different. Back in the present, Beck asked her how she would rate his performance. Still visibly shaken and with trembling hands, she replied that it was absolutely incredible. After he left, she thought to herself that Baek had managed to replicate the technique perfectly, just from seeing it once. He clearly possessed an extraordinary talent, perhaps even the greatest among all his siblings. She remembered his words about the king of martial arts, who had mastered all forms of combat, swordsmanship, hand-to-hand, spears, archery, and even mystical arts, and she wondered why the clan founded by such a man would limit itself to swordsmanship alone, especially now that Bayek had declared he would not follow in the clan's footsteps, but instead use every tool available to become stronger. Han Seong muttered to herself that perhaps training an heir wasn't such a bad idea after all, but even so, she believed Bayek still had a long road ahead of him. The scene then shifted to Beck lying on his bed, beaming as he opened his skill window. He said everything had been surprisingly easy, and that he would never grow tired of getting free skills. He recalled the conditions required to earn those skills. First, he had to train in arts unrelated to swordsmanship. Second, he had to say something that caught Han Seong's interest. And third, he needed to show her just how uniquely gifted he was. If he met all three conditions, she would teach him 2 techniques, one of which was Flowing Sky Mind technique, the very technique used by the martial arts king, centered around gathering mana and reinforcing the body. Beck admitted that from the outside, it all looked easy, but in truth, it was anything but. Even if he fulfilled the conditions, it would mean nothing if Han Seong didn't acknowledge his talent. He confessed he was getting a little arrogant. After all, his current potential didn't resemble the Beck everyone thought they knew. A talent like his was not something Han Seong could afford to overlook. The scene jumped to the day before the duel. Other trainees watched Bayek in disbelief. He hadn't stopped training since morning. Some even expressed concern that if he kept going at this pace, he might collapse before the match even started. Han Seong told him he needed to increase his movement speed a bit more to perform Qinggong more efficiently. The students were shocked. If that wasn't serious training already, what was? Meanwhile, Baek muttered to himself that they had no idea how brutal Han Seong could be as a teacher. As the sun set, Baek's training day came to an end. He was visibly exhausted. Han Seong told him he'd trained well today and should make sure he was in peak condition for tomorrow. He responded with a tired smile, saying everything he'd achieved so far was thanks to her and that he'd learned so much under her guidance. She looked surprised, admitting she hadn't expected him to follow her grueling routine so obediently, without a single complaint. He smiled again and told her he couldn't have done it without her constant encouragement. He asked her to stay by his side and continue training him, especially in the flowing sky mind technique and the Qinggong method she'd recently begun teaching him. She promised she would, and her expression betrayed her shock, especially when he said he still had much to learn. She told him that wasn't true. He had flawlessly mimicked flowing sky mind technique on his first try. She couldn't believe the clan leader had claimed he had no talent. Then, suddenly, the door to the training hall was kicked open with a loud crash. Everyone turned toward the sound and saw a furious Taerang storming in, his face twisted with rage. He shouted Bayek's name across the room. Bayek calmly told Han Seong to stay out of it and not to intervene. She didn't quite understand what he meant and asked him to clarify, but by then, he was already walking toward Taerang. Without hesitation, Baek lunged straight at him, but Taerang landed a powerful punch to his face, then grabbed him by the collar and shouted, demanding to know if Baek was doing all this to mock him. Baek replied with chilling calm, saying he had no idea what he was talking about. Enraged, Taerang asked why Baek hadn't just told their father he was dropping out of the competition. Baek, still perfectly composed, asked why he would do something like that. Taerang snapped, insisting that it was impossible for Baek to win, that his mere participation was humiliating, and that it was disgraceful to be forced to duel someone like him. Then Baek grabbed both his wrists and called him by name, directly. Baek asked him what had him so tense, then followed it with a sarcastic smile, suggesting he didn't actually believe Taerang was afraid of losing to him. Was he? He reminded him that their father had already approved the duel, and once that decision was made, neither of them could back down. A student nearby glanced at Taerang's hand and was shocked to see it trembling. Baek's words had clearly shaken him. Taerang laughed in response, admitting that Baek was right, and that it had been foolish of him to say what he had in the first place. He ended the conversation by saying he'd see Baek tomorrow in the arena, then added with a sinister grin that there were no rules preventing him from killing his opponent during a match, so Baek had better be prepared for what was coming. Taerang left with his entourage, who loudly cheered him on and joked that the fight wouldn't last long, that he'd crush Baek in no time. The day came to a close, and then dawned the long-awaited duel day. Yoo Jung-yeon was shown climbing the stairs, asking her attendant who had requested the duel. The attendant wasn't sure but said it was probably young Master Baek. Jung-yeon remarked that Yu Kang-ho had arrived early while Baek had yet to show up, and noted that the clan elders were already seated. Judging by their demeanor, they seemed to be on Taerang's side, but they weren't her main concern. It was that woman, Jaeyoon, standing alone. She had to bring her into her camp at any cost. At that moment, Baek finally arrived at the combat arena, and Jung-yeon noticed he wasn't alone. He'd come with instructor Han Seong, which surprised her. She had no idea what had brought them together. Baek looked up at the glass dome overhead and commented that he was grateful for the barrier shielding them from the snow and rain, though he wished it blocked the cold as well. He asked Han Seong if she agreed, and she replied that she didn't think he would lose. She added that she'd never seen him train so seriously before, and Baek laughed, saying even Songmin had been worried about him this morning. He commented that he didn't understand why everyone was making such a big deal about it. Han Seong replied that Kang-ho was known for his brutality, and she was worried Baek might get seriously hurt, even if he won. Baek smiled and said he had a funny story for her. His brother had always enjoyed wandering around since he was a kid. One day, he encountered a fierce beast that badly injured his right arm, and the medical team struggled to heal it. He said the reason he brought this up was to assure her that he could handle himself just fine. At that moment, the match was officially called to begin, and the contestants were asked to take their positions. Baek stood across from his brother, reading his expression and sensing the heavy aura around him, while Baek himself remained calm and composed, in contrast to Kang-ho, who looked enraged and dead set on not just winning, but annihilating his opponent. Kang-ho launched his attack using Sky Climbing Blade and 9 Dragon Fangs techniques, but Bayek noticed that the sequence wasn't fully formed yet. Kang-ho realized Bayek would try to dodge, so he pressed forward with everything he had to test Bayek's reaction. In that instant, Baek began to move, his mind flashing back to his days in the real world, to the countless struggles he'd faced trying to finish the game as Baek. No one helped him, no guides, no support, because Bayek was a throwaway character, one of the hardest to play. Suddenly, a risky but clever idea struck him. It might have been a little cowardly, but it could work. One of the game's mechanics allowed players to combine skills during combat. He had spent a long time thinking about how to merge the techniques he knew into something that could counter Kang-ho, and now he had the perfect plan. Right then, he stomped the ground, kicking up dust and pebbles toward his opponent. Kang-ho sneered at the move, saying he had wondered what Baek would try, but this pathetic trick only confirmed his weakness. But the next moment, the technique shifted. Baek had infused it with mana, turning the dust and stones into sharp shards of ice that slashed into Kang-ho's body. Seizing the moment, Baek rushed forward and landed a solid punch right to Kang-ho's face. Not stopping there, he stepped in and grabbed both of Kang-ho's arms, locking him down, leaving him unable to move.